Here we are. We are back. And I can say this is the third episode. I won't say how many I've actually recorded, but it is more than three. Why? Because I'm bad at this. Let's just say there are apparently a lot of technical problems that can happen when all you're recording is sound. Amazing. I don't want to talk about it. Who brought this up? Anyway, welcome to Magpie's Thoughts. I'm Daniel, and last time, like Scheherazade, I left you with a bit of a cliffhanger about what happens with the small states. The small states. What happens with the small states? And so, just to recap, we started by talking about all of the different issues we have with the way America runs. And I think it was all very valid. We talked about the Supreme Court. We talked about the Senate. Right? This is the first. I'm going all the way back. And we definitely talked about the way the president is elected, which of course goes back to the Senate. And we pointed out the Senate is not the most democratic place on earth. Totally fair. We're not trying to argue that it is the most fair place. Since every state gets two, that means places that are small are overrepresented and places that are big are... I'm not going to go through the whole arguments again, I promise. Places that are big are underrepresented. And if it wasn't so much of the Senate's power to impact the rest of everything, then it wouldn't be a big deal. But that's why we were talking about splitting states. But is that it? No, definitely not. But what about states that are small? What are their concerns? Because we talked a lot last time, so now I'm kind of, I'm walking through the last two podcasts, about the value of splitting big states. That it's not just about representation in Congress. It's about local issues being addressed. Different concerns need different legislatures. And that's what we're trying to talk about. But what if your state is small population? What if most people in your state agree on what the issues are? Well, you have a very different issue then. So let's talk about the solution and the bigger problem for smaller population states. I know I keep saying smaller population, less populated, depopulated. And it's because I don't want you to get confused and start thinking about, for example, Alaska. Is Alaska big or small? Alaska is small. I know, it's one of the only states that has less than 1 million people living there. I don't care how many square miles or square kilometers it has. It's about population right now. In other ways, yeah, I think it's really cool how big it is. But for now, we're just talking about population. So, let's talk about how to work with small states. So, the biggest problem that small states face is something called brain drain. And it impacts a lot of different areas of life in a state. So the basic concept is when kids go off, they go off to college anywhere, right? And you can be from anywhere and go to college anywhere. But then and some kids will come to your state to go to college, and other kids who are from this state go out to another state. And obviously there's also international people to make this math even crazier. But the question is, when the college time is done, where does the person end? So they've gone off to college, they've gotten their degree, and now what? And I'll get to non-college in a second. Do they say, well, I got this really great degree from UCLA, not moving to California, though. I'm going to move back home with my fancy degree. Fantastic. I went to MIT, but yeah, I don't want to live in Boston. Or is it the reverse? Are they saying, wow, I now have a fancy degree from a fancy school. I went to Dartmouth, and I now am going to stay here in New Hampshire. Completely possible. But we don't care where the kid ends up except for one question. What is the net gain and loss by state? Because each individual kid can do whatever they want. But it's the patterns we're looking for. And by and large, the smaller the population of your state is, the more you're going to lose on this exchange. Your state will lose a lot of people during this brain drain. So for every person that might come to your state during college and stay, or after they finished college, they decide to move to your state, if you're a low population state, you're losing someone else. And it's like, well, right, but I'm not saying small states are going to just shrink away. It's not about that. It's not about, well, what about... No. Take a simple concept. Let's say the smartest person in the world, IQ-wise, was born in Wyoming. And I'm going to make fun of Wyoming a lot. I'm so sorry, Wyoming. You are, by population, the smallest state. So, this person has an IQ way above everyone, right? They are genius potential here, all right? And they excel in school, nail everything, graduate early, and they end up going to some very fancy school, okay? And eventually, they get the choice of anywhere they want to work because they're a genius. And they're an engineer that has all these different fancy degrees that could make city planning anything you want to have them do. They will do it better than the people next to them. They could do urban planning. They could do disaster planning. If they become meteorologists, they're the ones that predict the storms better than anyone else, right? This is who this person is. Do they go back to living in Wyoming? Probably not. Statistically, probably not. Meanwhile, a state that has cool universities and has more infrastructure might have a university position for this person, and then when a problem arises that they can solve, they get that job. It's not about the money. It's about these more complicated problems are being solved locally. We don't have to outsource a solution. We have someone in our backyard that can solve the unsolvable problem. So, what the heck does that have to do with anything? Why is it a problem at all? It just seems like, well, yeah, but we can still solve these problems. Maybe, if you know that they're problems. And what is the solution is to have more people not leave. More people return. People from diverse areas. And I know somebody is listening to this saying, so cities. It doesn't have to be a city. You just need more people to offer more services. All right, I think I've wound up for the last 9 minutes. Let's talk about my idea. So, we're going to focus on the 10% smallest states. That is, states that are within the smallest 10%. Since we have 50 states, although we might not always have 50 states, we are talking about the 5 smallest states. And who, you might ask, are the 5 smallest states? We're talking about states like Vermont, number 2. Wyoming, number 1. I already said those two, right? The Dakotas and Alaska, North and South Dakota. and Alaska. That's the 5 smallest states by population. I promise. I'm not going to say any numbers, but all 5 are under 1 million people. Okay? So we're going to look at all 5 states, and we're going to ask one simple question. Do any of them share a border? Do they share a border? Well, actually, 3 of them do. Wyoming, South Dakota, and North Dakota touch. Or, if we want to be really specific about this, Wyoming touches South Dakota, and South Dakota also touches North Dakota. So, if that is the case, these states merge. They would become one state. And there's a lot of benefits here to creating a single state. And the benefits are very simple. First, any of the perceived strengths individually the states have, now they can combine. First, we get access to Canada. We have an international border. Most states don't have that. Especially, of the 3 of them, only North Dakota touches Canada. Right? And so that's a big deal. We now have access to an international border. Great. Fantastic. What else? Well, the parks are bigger now because we have Yellowstone. Okay, sure. So we have a giant national park. We have Amtrak routes that go through this state. Do they go through all 3 of these? Currently, as I say this, in 2024, no. Maybe someday they will. And I hope they do. But right now, they don't. And we have other major tourist attractions. But here's the thing. It's not just about tourism. It's about the brain drain. So the 3 states could merge their universities with multiple campuses. And by doing that, they can offer more advanced classes. Classes that right now, if someone from the Dakotas or Wyoming individually wanted to take, they'd have to go to Colorado. And no judgment, but the University of Colorado is way bigger than anything any of these states offer individually. But merged, they can suddenly offer a lot more. And this is the kind of thing we're talking about. We don't need to create a city here to network universities across a single strange-shaped state. And also, we need to acknowledge that this is a really big state, geographically. Remember, we're splitting California in half and probably splitting it in half again. So it's not like California is the big state anymore. These are already some of the larger states by area. Okay, I get it. There's some states that are bigger, Alaska looking at you. But they are bigger now that you're merging them. It's a huge, vast area. Excuse me. All right. So, why the 10%? Why not just say bottom 5? Well, because I don't know how many states there'll be someday. All right. Why not make it so they all merge? Why can't Vermont just merge into another state? Why do we have to do this rule? Okay, let's remind everyone where Vermont is. Okay? Vermont is part of New England. I'm going slowly so that you can picture it. So if you were standing in Vermont and looking north, you'd be looking at the Canadian border. In fact, Montreal isn't very far away from the Vermont border. If you were looking east, that's New Hampshire, which is not a big state itself, but it's not bottom 5 small. What if you were looking south? The very southern end of Vermont. That's Massachusetts. And west, that's the solid wall of New York. And so here's the problem. If we just say the 5 smallest states, or the bottom 10%, I don't care how you say it, are going to merge into whatever the smallest state they touch is. Now, obviously, if you have Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, they do the exact same thing. They always did. But now Vermont and New Hampshire would merge into each other. And now we have a problem. Because what's stopping it from being a few decades down the road, every state merging into each other until there's just one stupid state? Nothing. They would just keep merging, right? Because if you eliminate all the smallest states, then the next time round, you have even bigger, smaller states, which will continue to merge. And if you said, well, right, but you're cutting states in half on the other side, but you're not. You would stop doing that because the average size of the state would keep going up, the mean state. So you wouldn't do as many cuts as you think you would. You would end up with a single state. You'd have to make some reason to not make them keep merging. And the line I have is the bottom 5. Now, what's the value electorally? We need to kind of talk about the elephant in the room. It's easy to argue that Texas needs more senators. It should 2 senators for all of Texas? Are you kidding me? If I made 4 senators, it still feels kind of low, doesn't it? How about 8? That feels more right, given the number of people who live in Texas. But then we have to talk about the other end of the spectrum. That we have 3 states that have 6 senators. And it's insane how many senators we would have if we said, all right, every 250,000 people get 1 senator. Well, a few problems with this. First, we're turning the Senate into the House. But also, it's insane how many senators we'd have in California. California has over 30 million people, and there's only 100 senators, which would mean they'd all be from California. No. That was a joke. Don't take it too seriously. I think you get the point. That's not how it works. And we don't want to make the Senate into the House anyway. That's redundant. So a better way to deal with this is to say, I'm so sorry, but you 3 states will operate better if you were a single state. 1 state, Wyoming and both Dakotas would be merged into a single state. And what is the big value here towards America, not just looking inwards? It's that they were overrepresented. And that means that the best solution for America is that they get fewer senators. Now, if you're connected to a political party and you're like, now hang on, why? What's going to happen? Well, it's all going to level out. It's going to level out because other places will break apart states that will end up being more conservative. And you say, yeah, I don't care about Republicans and Democrats. I care about people like me. And I'm farming, right? And these states care about farming. Okay, valid point that there are very different kinds of Republicans. And that might be not the kind of Republican you get in Texas. It might be very different than the kind of Republican you get in the Dakotas. And so you're like, well, it's not the same. Darn it. Valid point. Me making all the points. But I would like to make a counter argument that points out states like Illinois. Now, Illinois is not really that far away from the Dakotas. It really isn't. And it would split in half. Now, where would it split in half? Basically, Greater Chicago would become one state, and the rest would be farming. It'd be, it'd be the rest of the state. It's all focused much more on agriculture. And even if these people lean to the right or to the left, they share more in common with you once you make Chicago, Greater Chicago, its own state. The rest of Illinois, which we might call South Illinois, in the tradition of like South Dakota, there's now South Illinois, we make it its own state. And so those two senators will have the same concerns as a lot of the ones did from the Dakotas. And it's not like we're getting rid of all of the representation. Okay? There's still Senate representation for this area, just not as much. It's a little less. It's redistributed. And so I also don't think it's valuable to look at the current political alignment. Politicians and the way they're aligned, the Democratic and Republican parties have literally flipped without us doing something like this. This amount of change would literally change where the parties align. And it would. And it's okay. We're allowed to do things like this. At least here at Magpie's Thoughts, where anything is worth considering and we're thinking about the ramifications. But why? You might wonder, what's the point of it all? Why bother doing these kind of grand, dramatic changes to states? Completely valid. I understand that these will feel dramatic, but first, most states wouldn't change at all. The biggest states would get cut in half. The smallest 3 states would get merged. But most states, if you're in most states, there wouldn't be any change at all. Because that's the point. We're trying to get everybody closer to the population of those middle states. Middle by population, I think it's somewhere around the 6 million line. So a lot of states just would kind of be there. They're already there. That's the size of a state. And it changes the way we view amendments. Amendments will be a little bit easier to pass. And here's the key thing to think about whenever you hear this. This is currently. We have no current way to change borders. No easy methodology to do any of these. We'd have to do each border individually right now. Which is just madness, given how much it doesn't match our needs. So in 100 years, no one can predict where the population centers are and aren't. For all we know, climate change is going to make every state that touches Canada double in size. And it'll get so big in Alaska that it'll become split and split again. And Alaska becomes 4 states. And all of them are the 4 largest states in America. We can't know. We can't know. And so we're trying to create a system that will be able to sustain through our unpredictable world far into the future without any vague language that the Founding Fathers used in their Bill of Rights that now we constantly end up arguing about. We're not doing that. We know that 100 years from now, things that we thought were super obvious won't be. So we'll be very specific in our language. All of this data would come from the U.S. Census Bureau, and after they've compiled it, they would announce And that's when there would be a certain time delay, which would be prescribed in the amendment. I'm not saying it because I don't actually care, but it would be defined. And so all of the changeovers would happen organically before the next election. Maybe it would be 3 years after the every 10 years census that they have to start changing over, and they have another 2 years to get it solid. It could be like that, because most of the time, most places, especially after the initial round of changes, which would be the most dramatic, after 2 rounds of changes, everything would kind of settle, and most places wouldn't change for decades. And that's the point. It still could change 200 years later. We could end up with really unusual and unexpected things. And that's good. Because if we didn't, we would have people in the far future complaining that they don't understand why the most populated place in America, with 50 million people, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, isn't its own state. And we would laugh, right? That sounds like the most insane thing. Nobody lives there. It's not even a majority or even half of Michigan. And I'm saying, what if in the future it's most of Michigan? I can't predict the future, neither can you. We can't predict it 10 years from now. 20 years is maybe the best predictive person can do in the most predictable industry. But I'm going to leave you there.